Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our Sunday School Teacher Workshop. Here we are with our second session of this unit, coming from 1 Kings 12 and 14. Of course, the title, as you see, working with the theme that they have for the first four lessons or first unit, is a divided something. Last week we were talking about the divided kingdom being passed from Solomon, where it was still united, of course, to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the kings who will take over and rule both Judah and Israel. This week we are looking at the same thing pretty much, except we're going a little bit deeper into the story of Jeroboam. As I said last week, I borrowed a little bit from this story to kind of finish the arc with respect to talking about Jeroboam and what he does to establish idolatry within Israel. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but as we discuss a few bit more details of what the text actually says, there's much more going on here than just that simple fact of him establishing idolatry within the land. So we're going to take a look at what these passages actually have to say and the particular details that are included for us by the author. So I'm retitling this lesson, A Mockery of Israel's History as Punishment. Punishment for what? Punishment for basically the thing that we were talking about last week, the fact that God had attempted to try to reestablish a foothold within Israel and rescue them from the idolatry that Solomon had led them into, with all the debauchery that he had brought into Israel because of his heart being bent toward his wives who were not of Israel's stock. And as he built shrines for the gods that they worshipped, he too enjoined himself to this and eventually led Israel to accompany him in this by his example. So, fracturing the kingdom and giving a larger portion to a new king who's not from David's line, this person named Jeroboam, was his attempt at trying to rescue Israel through a new Exodus. And we talked last week through some of those hyperlinks about how Jeroboam in the text is poised to be a new Moses figure. Those details led us to a place where we could assume this is what he would do and how his role would function within the story if he was obedient. But here's where we see, even though we took a little bit from this story and added it into last week's to show that he does not indeed deliver on that. But this week is adding a few more layers into how, with some sense of immediacy based off the way the story is written, though this probably took, a few years to develop into the place where we see Israel practicing the level of idolatry that Jeroboam leads them into, because things have to be constructed, right? These calves have to be made, the shrines have to be built, and then the system of cultic practice with respect to offering these sacrifices and whatnot, and establishing a new priesthood within Israel. That, of course, would take a little bit of time to actually execute. So because of the fact this was supposed to be a new Exodus, but it never even gets off the ground, it immediately stalls out. Then what we are seeing as this part of the story develops, with respect to describing Jeroboam's reign, it becomes something of a recapitulation of Israel's history and some moments when Israel, as a clan and eventually a nation, even a people that don't exist yet, with respect to Abraham at certain points in the story, are progressing toward a new creation moment. What I mean by that is we go back to those Genesis stories. They are progressing toward the goal that God has outlined for them. But now it seems like that those goals and what Israel is supposed to be doing as a nation is a complete mockery of what God had commissioned them to do. So let's get into this and try to make a little bit more sense of that. So what I'm doing in these orange blocks is I'm pointing out a few key details with respect to what the author is pointing out, as goes building projects that Jeroboam undertakes. Now, the reason why I think this is important for us to capitalize on is because we might not see it yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and spoil it for you because it's going to take us a little while to get there. But by the time we get to a place in Second Kings, I'm sorry, not Second Kings, First Kings, chapter 16. So we're not too far from it, but we're going to be introduced to King Ahab and the Omride dynasty that began with his father. And we're going to be told that a certain person, his name is rather obscure, it's not of importance, but he chooses to rebuild the city of Jericho. By the time we're introduced to Omri and Ahab, we see how the political capital has shifted away from Shechem. And through other kings, it was moved around until eventually, with Omri, he purchases a mound of land from a person named Shemer. And eventually, it is renamed Samaria. And he builds the capital there. But of course, his son is going to aggrandize on it much more. And when he takes the hand of Ethbel III's daughter, who is the king and high priest of the Phoenician nation, ruled from Tyre and Sidon, that eventually she, becoming Ahab's wife, is going to introduce Baalism on a far greater scale than it had been operative in Israel at that point. Baal has no doubt had his shrines where people has worshipped him. That's going on even in this moment in Israel's history, but it becomes a center point of focus because Yahwehism and the worship of him is dramatically reduced during the days of Ahab and Jezebel, and of course God's prophet Elijah. He's not the only one. There are other prophets commensurate to his time, or I should say contemporary to his time. But the point is that it arrives at a place where eventually Elijah is standing before the Lord. And while he does say this with a measure of error in it, he's not the only one left, either as a worshiper of Yahweh or even a prophet of Yahweh. But he is somewhat truthful in his representation that the worshipers of Yahweh have been greatly reduced, because even Yahweh himself says that he has reserved 7,000 in the scope of hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of Israelites in the northern kingdom who have left the worship of Yahweh at his altar and have followed instead the example of worshiping Baal and the pantheon that he rules over. So back to this concept of building Jericho here, before we really get deep into the Ahab story, we're told this person rebuilds the city of Jericho. And that too seems a little bit weird and obscure as to why exactly this is mentioned. It's like the author just drops that off there to say, hey, oh, by the way, during this time, the city of Jericho was rebuilt. But if we keep in mind how this story is functioning in tandem with everything that Israel had went through from the moment Abram is called to follow Yahweh, and that Yahweh will bless him with a nation of people who will come from him. And then how that story progresses through their migration into Egypt, 400 years sojourn there, the Exodus and the rescue out of Egypt, their migration into Canaan, and how all that happens through Moses and Joshua. It seems as if what's going on in the northern kingdom is an attempt to try to shed any sense of that. That when the city of Jericho is rebuilt, that was supposed to be a continual heap of ruins for all time, for every generation of Israelite to remember that this is what God did as soon as they crossed the land and they faced the first city on the map. But that this was a perpetual testimony, not only to what happens when people walk away from Yahweh, which these Canaanites had done generations ago through Babel, but also as a testimony to the fact that God was faithful in bringing them into the land, and he delivered this inheritance to them, and Jericho was handed over to them, and they really didn't have to do much fighting in order to secure it. So that being said, this too was a testimony to this rebellious northern nation who has been slipping into apostasy further and further by the time of Ahab. And when this city is rebuilt, it's as if it's trying to wipe away any trace of what Yahweh did. It's to take away the curse upon those who worship foreign gods and by the power of their own might, and instead to say that this is who we are and this is what we stand upon, not the worship of Yahweh, but the worship of other gods. So we are progressing toward that. And so with these details that we're looking at here, it makes sense how this becomes something of an open mockery of Israel's history, in an attempt to slowly wipe the page clean of any trace of Yahweh in the northern kingdom. So we start with this detail in 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 25 that Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. So this is one and the same Shechem. Apologies, my tablet was propped up and it fell down, made that thud. I won't prop it back up again so that doesn't happen again. Anyway, he built Shechem. This is the one in the same Shechem that Abraham had migrated to once he finally entered the land of Israel. after those years of journeying from his home in Ur of Chaldea in the Mesopotamian River Valley, eventually into the land of Canaan. In fact, this was the very place that he stopped by Shechem in at the Oak of Moriah. Genesis chapter 12, right? Now, this is important because this becomes one of the sites that Abraham frequents the most as he migrates through the land of Canaan in the near 40 plus years that he lives there. In fact, this was the place where Yahweh came to visit him with two other angels in the form or guise of human beings around Genesis 18, when first the Lord tells Abraham, within a year, Sarah will be holding that promised child whose name will be Isaac in her arms. And then also tells him of the plans of what he's about to do with respect to Sodom and Gomorrah to face the injustice that has come up to his throne as others have cried out with respect to what's going on there. So when it speaks to the idea that Jeroboam built Shechem as a particular place of importance for him in his newly founded kingdom, then and he carves this out seemingly as his capital, then it invokes Abram's origin story. Now, Abram's origin story back in Genesis 12 was supposed to signal for the biblical reader a new Exodus and new creation moment, right? He's migrating out of the Mesopotamian River Valley, which is practically ground zero for where the Tower of Babel moment happened, especially where he lives in Ur, because that is on the plain of Shinar, which is the early kingdom of Babylon before the days of, say, uh, what is his name? Hammurabi, one of the most famous kings of Babylon's treasured past. We're going back to the days of Nimrod here, who actually founded the kingdom and was there when the tower was being built. So, all that to say, Abraham is in the shadow of what happened there. And he too is credited as being an idol worshiper from the very words of Joshua, a descendant of Abraham, as Joshua is speaking to Israel for one of the last times as a fully gathered nation in the book that bears his name. So, that being said, we understand that when God called Abraham, he is bringing him out of this area, migrating him to a new land that is going to become the epicenter of the world. No longer the Mesopotamian River Valley, but rather the land of Canaan, once Israel is firmly established there and the name of the land changes to the name of people that God will give him, which of course is not the name of Abraham, it's the name of his grandson who's not even born yet, right? So that's all what we see going on in that story in the early stages of it when God moves a single man and his wife to begin this process. And it's supposed to be a new creation, not only for these people, but for all humanity, because God says he's going to bless all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth through this man in his yet to be family. So then we move on to the rest of this verse just to finish it up. And from there, he went out to build Penuel. So what's interesting about this is this could be the place for sure in the first half of the verse. The Shechem that's mentioned there is indeed the Shechem of Abram's day. This place, Penuel, may be the same Peniel that's mentioned here in Genesis chapter 32. The proximity of location would seemingly suggest so, because in this particular moment right here, what we have is Jacob is migrating back to the land of Israel after about 20 years of being absent from the land because of what happened when he stole his brother's birthright and then blessing. And then he goes off to Padan Aram to meet his extended family, takes wives there, has children, and is now coming back to the land because of Laban's exploitation of his labor and all that. So as he's coming back to the land, he knows, as he's heard word, Esau is moving out to him with 400 men. So he's expecting a showdown. And of course, Jacob has no means of defending himself. He's hoping here that somehow Yahweh is going to procure mercy for him in the eyes of Esau, and Esau will spare him. All that to say, as we are getting down to the wire here, the very night before Esau is going to show up, this is when Jacob has divided his camp and he is the last person in line. Esau will meet, and there the angel of the Lord comes and meets him and wrestles with him all night long until the early morning hours of the sunrise, right? And so that place's name is changed to Peniel, which means face of God, because he met God face to face in the personage of the angel of the Lord. So his moment of complete total humility here, where he's at his lowest, his most vulnerable, where he does indeed humble himself. And because of this, the Lord changes his name to no longer be the heel grabbing trickster Jacob, but instead to be the one who wrestles with God and prevails, i.e., Israel. This becomes a new creation moment for him, his people. And of course, it's important for the nations as well, because now this is the bedrock upon which God is building the promise to Abram, who became Abraham, much as Jacob has now become Israel. And this people who are descending from him are going to inherit this land, as God has already promised Jacob before, several chapters earlier. And then through them, he is going to accomplish the promise he made to Abraham. So if this is indeed the same place, named face of God, what is Jeroboam going to be doing to it, right? I mean, these become fortified cities on the southern borders of Israel's new kingdom. And of course, they have particular importance for Jeroboam, and who knows what debauchery winds up happening in these places because of it. They are not the places that house the shrines built to the calves where idolatry is practiced, but idolatry is going to be practiced all throughout the land, as far as every high place under every green tree where they can build shrines and altars and so forth. So this too becomes something of a mockery of this place that had particular importance for Israel in her past. And then even the story of Moses is invoked here, just 2 verses later in verse 27. This is what we hear Jeroboam saying as he is voicing his concern of what will happen if he allows these people to go back and forth to Jerusalem, where they are going to offer their offerings to Yahweh on the altar where it's required, because it's not sanctioned for them to offer anything anywhere other than this particular place. He says they will kill me and they will go back to the king of Judah. So, whereas last week we talked about how that puts Jeroboam somewhat in the shadow of Aaron in Exodus 32, when he responds to the people's whims, their desire for something to worship. Taking a little bit of a different angle here, instead, we're looking at this Numbers 14 moment, when this was not so promising, of course, for Moses. This is not a particular bright moment as the previous mentions were for Abraham and Jacob. Rather, this seems to be echoing the very moment when Israel is at the brink of going into the land. They have sent 12 spies, one to represent every tribe, into the land for 40 days and nights. Those spies have just come out of the land, and now they are giving their report over to the Israelites of what they've seen. 10 spies basically convinced the entire nation that this is not worth it. There's no way they can accomplish this. They might as well just go back to Egypt. So that's what they do. They decide, let's appoint a new leader and let's go back to Egypt. So this seems to be the point in the story where we are looking at everything that was said about Jeroboam from the moment he's introduced to us as a particular worker or servant of importance in Solomon's kingdom, who represents the tribe of Ephraim, and how he rebels against Solomon. But all this is going on at the time in the story where the writer has shifted focus away from Solomon's accomplishments to now his debauchery and apostasy. And that we see through the progression of this, Jeroboam, as we discussed last week, is being poised as the new Moses figure. So for him to, for the writer to say that Jeroboam has built Shechem and Peniel is not necessarily a bad thing at this particular moment. It has not signaled anything for us that is outright depraved. It's not until this particular verse here in verse 27 where we just slap our foreheads with our hand thinking, oh no, oh no. This is where the thing begins to completely unravel, because it's like the people of Israel on the southern border of Egypt, hearing the words of the spies, and much to the surprise of Joshua, Caleb, and even Moses, that the people are now responding to the words of these 10 spies, and they are all weeping, lamenting, mourning that this calamity has come upon them, that they are here at this place, this liminal spot where they're stuck. They can't progress forward, because if they do, the Canaanites are just going to stomp them like grasshoppers. And they're out in this wilderness where they can't continue to sustain themselves on a permanent basis. So what do? They figure the best option is to go back to Egypt. So this is exactly what Jeroboam does when he says they're going to kill me, because that's what the full context says, that they'll eventually go back to Rehoboam and denounce him as their king, So the better thing to do would be to instead procure worship of Yahweh on a different basis here in the land of Israel by creating these calves and putting them in these particular shrines. Not only does he become a new Aaron in this moment, but he becomes the entirety of that wilderness generation who decided it was better for them to go back to Egypt. He is purposefully plunging Israel back into Egyptian based idolatry with these calves because that's exactly what the symbolism behind them represent. So with this, we take a little bit of a look at both Jeroboam and Rehoboam as kings in Israel and Judah to see how this Israel or Exodus is still going further off the rails. We already know about Jeroboam and the building of the two calves, the making the shrines, and the fact that he made priests that were not Levites. So what's interesting here is this becomes something of an antithetical picture of what happened with Moses in the wilderness, because Moses is instructed to take his brother Aaron and install him as priest, high priest over Israel. Aaron, of course, is a Levite, as all of his sons are as well. And so those sons who become clan leaders within Aaron's family, from which candidates for the high priest can come from, are surrounded by the greater throng of Israel or Levites who get to help them as consecrated servants within the tabernacle setting. But Jeroboam here is actually kind of flipping from being Aaron in the previous frame over here in verse 28 to now in verse 31, becoming something like a bizarro version of Moses. So again, I use that term bizarro if you haven't watched that little 10-minute vignette for this lesson. Bizarro is a character in the Superman story arc, right? If you're familiar with this, it should make sense. If not, let me explain it real quick. But Bizarro is a cloned version of Superman, but he is completely the opposite of Superman, to the very point where the S on Superman's chest is inverted backwards on Bizarro's chest. And he does everything the complete opposite of Superman and Clark Kent. So basically, here, what we're getting is a Bizarro version of Moses because Jeroboam has installed a new priesthood that's not Levitical for a particular purpose. And instead of destroying calves, he makes calves. Instead of condemning the people for their idolatrous ways and trying to draw them back to Yahweh as the king should, he is pushing them further off the cliff into this very thing and thinking that this is righteous action. And even though the story is about Jeroboam, we do actually need to take a look at Rehoboam too, because here Judah is not divorced from this. In fact, Rehoboam is continuing or doubling down on his father's very example, pushing the people further into idolatry, as we're told here in First Chronicles chapter 12, that Rehoboam completely abandoned the law of the Lord, he and all Israel with him. Now, I chose a section from Chronicles because the writer of Kings doesn't give the depth of detail the writer of Chronicles does. The writer of Chronicles seems to give us a pause in the story where after Rehoboam goes back to Jerusalem, Ahijah convinces him not to go out and attack the Israelites because what has happened has been orchestrated by Yahweh. That Rehoboam, for a period of a couple of years, seems to be minding his P's and Q's somewhat. He seems to be obedient to the Lord, but then as soon as he realizes that the kingdom is firmly established in his hands, I don't know what exactly led him to be convinced of this, but nonetheless, vaunted in his own pride, he decides to completely abandon the law of the Lord. And so he goes to worshiping all of these gods that his father did at the altars and high places built for them. And so in 1 Kings 14, which is part of our reading here, we are told that King Shishak of Egypt goes to war against Jerusalem. He took everything. Now, just as an aside here, because I'm sure some of you teachers are perhaps a bit more historically inclined, uh, with respect to names, places, key events, and whatnot. Study Bibles most of the time have a tendency to identify this person here as being King Shawshank of Egypt, as a point of kind of historically synchronizing these events with other historical contemporary events at the time as to who exactly this person was and trying to find evidence of it. But for the most part, this solidifies the date of the Exodus being during the reigns of both Seti I and Ramses II, better known to history as Ramses the Great. The problem with that will be if we use that date for the Exodus, there's literally no archaeological evidence for an Exodus that occurred during that time period. So it's a fallacy to build the idea of an Exodus that never happened under these two particular Egyptian pharaohs to then later on talk about a historically synchronized moment when these Israelites worshiping um, at a temple that Solomon built 480 years after the Exodus actually occurred, per the historical record in Scripture, to then synchronize that with the rule of a king, Shoshenq in Egypt, who came and sacked the city of Jerusalem and its temple and carted off its goods. I would encourage you to look at the works of David Rohl, an Egyptologist who actually does a lot to undermine, countermand the typical or traditional Egyptian historical record, and instead recalibrates much of their history to realign dates and kings with important historical biblical events. Not because he's a believer so much, but more so, and I don't think he is a believer, but more so because he recognizes the problems inherent within Egyptian chronology. So instead of it being Shawshank, he actually postulates with good reason and historical information that would seem to suggest that this person was actually Ramses the Great, who did lead a campaign into Jerusalem and actually carted off quite a few goods. So rather than Ramses being the pharaoh of the Exodus, Ramses the Great, whose nickname was Shosher. Um, I'm sorry, not Shosher, Shisha. That's right. Whose nickname was Shisha. Um, was perhaps the king who was responsible for this. All that to simply say that we have a new pharaoh, whoever this Shawshank is, who was used to actually oppress the new pharaoh, Rehoboam, that's reigning in the Egypt of this story, which is not really the old Egypt that Israel was enslaved in, but rather the new Egypt of their spiritual slavery, carved out by the king who preceded Rehoboam, i.e., Solomon. So, all this to show that Israel is falling further and further off the cliff from the previous story. Well, I hope that's helpful to you. And of course, I'll leave it to you to come up with any particular points of application you might think is important with respect to this. Um, because as we look at these, we are not really being given any information here in the form of a command that we need to follow or a practical point of wisdom here that's isolated from the story that was told to us. And even if we move over to the story as it's recapitulated in Chronicles, we can see a far more spiritualized version of this. But nonetheless, it doesn't necessarily speak to us in a way that shows us this is what you should avoid, other than what's been consistently reiterated over and over again through all these stories. Human pride is toxic. And of course, it's meant to drive us further from Yahweh in this broken sense, or this broken world that we live in. Our flesh hates God and it does everything it can to try to rebel against it, right? This is what Paul is saying in Romans and Galatians, that if we walk by the flesh, we are constantly at war with the Holy Spirit who lives within us, that is working to sanctify us and draw us away from doing these depraved things that our flesh wants us to do. And why? Because our flesh hates God. So that's built into this story, yes. But more so, it's to show on the far greater scale, and this is why the meta narrative is so important. We're just landing at another spot in this where we're seeing the progression of it. Things are getting worse. Yahweh had attempted a course correction through the appointment of Jeroboam. It did not work, not because it's God's fault, it's because of human beings who choose to do what they do, even when they're offered wonderful opportunities and great privilege in doing what Yahweh wants them to do. Instead of partnering with Him, they just responded to their own fears, insecurities, or work by their own agenda and make a mess of what He had attempted to try to do. So it's important for us to see that, but that we know on the horizon, God is going to be bringing a new Exodus moment. That's inevitable because He does not leave His people in a place like this. He will rescue His remnant. That's for sure. So hopefully that's helpful. Thanks for listening.